Ethan Carter's sprawling ranch had been his family's pride for generations, a living legacy of hard work, rugged independence, and the simple joys of country living. Nestled amid wide-open pastures and dotted with weathered barns, the ranch was more than just property. It was his sanctuary and the heart of his identity. Every morning, as the sun peeked over the horizon, Ethan would rise to the sound of cattle lowing and the gentle rustle of wind through the cottonwood trees. Whether he was mending fences or checking on his herd, every moment on the ranch was a tribute to the traditions his father and grandfather had instilled in him. Ethan, a former military man turned rancher, took immense pride in the legacy he was entrusted with. He managed his land with a quiet dignity and a fierce determination to preserve the independence that defined his way of life. But over the past few months, an unwelcome force had begun to encroach on his property. A force masquerading as community improvement, but in reality, a manifestation of overreaching bureaucracy. Enter Karen Miller, the self-proclaimed enforcer of the local homeowners association, HOA. Karen prided herself on her impeccable appearance, always dressed in sharply tailored skirts and polished shoes, with a clipboard clutched tightly in her hand. To her, every property in the community was subject to her iron-fisted standards, regardless of its history or character. And now, it seemed, Karen had set her sights on Ethan's beloved ranch. The conflict first came to a head one sweltering morning when Ethan arrived at the trough to water his cattle, only to discover that the main water line, the very lifeblood of his operation, had been severed. The sight was shocking. A clean, deliberate cut across a pipe that ran alongside the ranch's fence line, leaving dry earth and stranded livestock in its wake. Out of the dust, Karen appeared as if summoned by the act itself, a look of smug satisfaction on her face. "Ethan, I'm afraid you're in serious violation of our community standards," Karen announced loudly, as if the water line were nothing more than a minor infraction. "Our records show that your property does not conform to the approved layout. The water line must be maintained properly to ensure fairness and uniformity across the neighborhood." Ethan's blood ran cold. His ranch depended on that water line to irrigate crops, quench thirsty livestock, and keep the land flourishing. "Karen cut my water line? This isn't a harmless oversight, it's sabotage," he retorted, his voice steady despite the anger simmering inside. "This line is critical to the ranch. Without it, my animals suffer and my crops die. I won't stand for it." Karen's eyes narrowed, and her tone became icy. "The rules apply to everyone, Ethan. If you refuse to comply with the community guidelines, the HOA will take further action. Consider this a final warning." With a dismissive wave of her clipboard, she strode away, leaving Ethan fuming and his ranch parched. Standing amid the barren patch where water should have flowed freely, Ethan felt a profound sense of violation. His property, his sanctuary, had been deliberately undermined by someone who saw no value in tradition or individual rights. That first confrontation, brief yet searing, marked the beginning of a battle between a proud rancher determined to protect his legacy and an overzealous HOA enforcer bent on imposing conformity at any cost. As twilight descended over the dry fields, Ethan sat on the edge of his porch, the weight of the day pressing upon him. He knew that Karen's actions were not an isolated incident. They were the first move in a calculated campaign to control every aspect of his life. And with that realization, Ethan silently vowed to fight back, to defend every drop of water, every inch of land, and every bit of history that his ranch represented. The morning after the water line incident, Ethan awoke to a foreboding sight, an official-looking envelope taped neatly to his weathered ranch door, bearing the HOA seal. With a sinking heart, he tore it open and found a fine of $750 for unauthorized interference with community infrastructure. The document was a tapestry of legal jargon and threats, a clear message that the HOA, under Karen's control, intended to make an example of him. Before Ethan could even process the contents of the notice, he stepped outside and found Karen waiting at the edge of his property. Her posture was rigid and her expression, as always, smugly superior. "Good morning, Ethan," she said crisply. "I trust you've read the notice. The rules apply to everyone. and your noncompliance endangers our community's order." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Karen, cutting my water line is not a minor infraction. It's sabotage. My ranch relies on that water. You're not enforcing community standards. You're attacking my livelihood." Unfazed by his protest, Karen replied in a tone that brooked no argument. "It is my duty to ensure that all properties within our jurisdiction conform to our standards. Your actions leave me no choice but to impose this fine and issue further warnings if you do not rectify the situation immediately." Later that morning, while Ethan inspected his dry fields and the barren remnants of his water line, a nondescript van pulled up near his property. Out stepped two inspectors in uniform, clipboards in hand. They began measuring the cut water pipe, snapping photos of the exposed, damaged line, and taking notes with a clinical precision. Ethan watched, heart pounding, as they treated his critical infrastructure like a minor code violation. Determined not to be bullied, Ethan began documenting every detail of the intrusion. He snapped pictures of the inspectors in action, recorded snippets of their conversation, and even jotted down the exact time of their arrival. His phone became a tool of resistance, a means to capture the overreach in indisputable evidence. By mid-afternoon, with the inspectors having left and the dry silence settling over his ranch, Ethan retreated to his small, cluttered office in the barn. There, he drafted a formal complaint addressed to the county zoning office. In his letter, he cited local agricultural exemptions, historical preservation statutes, and the long-standing rights of property owners to manage their land without interference. His complaint was not only a legal challenge, it was a personal manifesto against the tyranny of an HOA that seemed intent on controlling every facet of his life. Word of the incident spread quickly through the rural community. At local gatherings and in quiet conversations at the feed store, other ranchers and homeowners murmured about the arbitrary fines and the invasive inspections they had also experienced. Although many had endured Karen's heavy-handed tactics in silence, Ethan's open defiance had stirred something in the community, a sense of solidarity against an unjust system. That evening, as the sky darkened and the distant sound of crickets filled the air, Karen returned to Ethan's property. Under the glow of a single porch light, she delivered a new ultimatum. "You have 48 hours to restore the water line to proper working condition, Ethan, or additional penalties will be imposed," she warned in a voice that brooked no dissent. Ethan's response was measured but resolute. "I will repair my water line when and how I see fit," he said, his tone steady as the night around him. "I will not be bullied into submission by your arbitrary rules." As he closed the door behind him, Ethan knew that this was only the beginning of a long, bitter struggle, a struggle not just for water, but for his very way of life. In the days following the water line debacle, the conflict escalated rapidly. What began as a single act of sabotage had become a full-blown campaign against Ethan's ranch. The inspector's intrusion was not an isolated incident. It was a deliberate power move designed to intimidate and control. Rumors began circulating among neighboring property owners that Karen was systematically targeting anyone who dared to defy the HOA's dictates, imposing fines for trivial reasons and using the threat of legal action to enforce her arbitrary rules. One overcast afternoon, while Ethan was repairing a section of the damaged water line, his longtime friend and fellow rancher, Tom, pulled up beside him. "Ethan, you're not alone in this," Tom said in a hushed, urgent tone. "I've heard that Karen's been cutting water lines and issuing fines left and right. People are scared, but they're also angry. They say the money from the fines is disappearing into a secret fund for her personal projects." Tom's revelation struck a nerve. Ethan's frustration transformed into determined resolve. This wasn't just about one water line. It was about a pattern of corruption and abuse of power. Determined to expose the full extent of the HOA's misconduct, Ethan began a covert investigation. He visited the county clerk's office to scrutinize the HOA's records, attended board meetings incognito, and even recorded whispered conversations among disgruntled neighbors. Every piece of evidence he gathered painted a damning picture. Karen was not enforcing community standards. She was exploiting them for personal gain. Late one rainy night, as thunder rolled over the ranch and lightning illuminated the barren water channel, Ethan pored over copies of financial ledgers and anonymous notes. He compiled a comprehensive dossier that detailed irregularities in the HOA's finances, including unexplained transfers and forged documents. Each new piece of evidence confirmed what he had long suspected. The HOA was a tool for extortion, and Karen was its ruthless enforcer. As word of Ethan's investigation spread, more ranchers began to come forward with their own stories of arbitrary fines and invasive inspections. At a secret meeting held in the back room of the local feed store, several frustrated property owners recounted how they'd been harassed by the HOA. One elderly rancher tearfully described how a minor misalignment of a fence had resulted in a crippling fine, while another admitted that he'd been pressured into paying voluntary contributions that never benefited the community. The collective outcry was growing, and Ethan's resolve deepened. He installed additional security cameras along the perimeter of his property and logged every instance of trespassing and inspection. His phone became a repository for evidence, photos, videos, and detailed notes that documented every infringement on his rights. Meanwhile, Karen's tactics only became more draconian. In a series of curt, official letters, she threatened that continued noncompliance with the HOA guidelines would lead to the seizure of property rights. Rumors even surfaced that the HOA might pursue legal action to reclaim sections of ranch land deemed unsightly or nonconforming. Under the oppressive shadow of these threats, Ethan's determination hardened like the dry earth of his ranch. He reached out to local journalists, handing over copies of his dossier and the compelling evidence he had gathered. Soon, local newspapers picked up the story, publishing headlines that condemned the arbitrary fines and the invasive practices imposed by Karen's regime. As the storm clouds gathered overhead on another dark night, Ethan stood outside his ranch, staring out at the parched land that had been so ruthlessly deprived water. He vowed that he would not allow the HOA's corruption to continue unchecked. This battle was not just about water. It was about the right to manage one's own land, to preserve a legacy, and to stand up against tyranny. The pressure reached a boiling point one early morning when Ethan arrived at his ranch to find an even more audacious violation. The HOA had not only cut his water line, but they had also tampered with the irrigation controls, effectively shutting off all water supply to his fields. This act of defiance against his property was the last straw. Determined to fight back, Ethan knew that he had to take decisive public action. After consulting with legal experts and local engineers, he devised a bold plan, not only to restore the water line, but to turn the tables on Karen. He hired a reputable contractor to repair the damage, and as part of his countermeasure, he installed advanced water metering systems that would record every drop that flowed through his line. His idea was simple yet ingenious. He would sue Karen for $100,000 and bill her for every drop of water lost due to her interference. Armed with this plan and his growing dossier of evidence, Ethan prepared for the next HOA meeting, a critical turning point that would expose the full extent of Karen's abuse of power. On the day of the meeting, the town hall was packed with concerned homeowners and skeptical board members. The atmosphere was tense, charged with anticipation. Taking the stage, Ethan calmly presented his case. He began by detailing the sequence of events: the unauthorized water line cut, the invasive inspections, and the arbitrary fines that had followed. Then, he revealed the sophisticated water metering data that showed exactly how much water had been lost, every drop meticulously recorded and accounted for. "This isn't just a fine," he declared. "It's a quantifiable loss, a loss that I am now holding Karen financially responsible for." The room erupted into murmurs of shock and approval. Ethan's presentation was a masterclass in precision and justice, leaving little room for denial. With every piece of evidence, he dismantled Karen's narrative. He laid out copies of official documents, photographs of the cut water line, and detailed reports from independent inspectors. The comprehensive nature of his evidence was undeniable. As Ethan spoke, several board members exchanged uneasy glances. It was clear that even those who had once supported Karen were beginning to question her methods. Yet, Karen remained at the back of the room, her face a mask of defiance. When she attempted to interject, Ethan's calm and measured tone cut her off. "My property is my legacy," he said firmly. "And no one, especially not an overreaching enforcer like you, has the right to jeopardize it." The impact of Ethan's words was immediate. Homeowners began to voice their support for him, and even a few board members nodded in agreement. It was the beginning of a public reckoning, a turning point in the battle against Karen's tyranny. That evening, as Ethan returned to his ranch, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The electrifying atmosphere of the meeting had not only exposed the depth of the HOA's corruption, but it also united the community behind him. His water metering system, a symbol of his innovative counterattack, now stood as a testament to his determination to seek justice for every drop lost due to Karen's interference. Ethan knew that the battle was far from over. Karen's tactics would undoubtedly escalate, but so would his resolve. With his evidence in hand and the support of a community awakened to the injustice, he was ready to pursue every legal avenue to hold her accountable, a pursuit that would soon lead him to sue for $100,000 and bill her for every single drop of water lost. With Ethan's legal challenge gaining momentum and the community rallying behind him, Karen realized she was losing control. In a desperate bid to reassert her authority, she resorted to an extreme tactic. She attempted to stage one final act of intimidation. Late one evening, Karen made a bold move. She called the local police and reported that Ethan's repaired water line was tampered with, claiming it posed a public hazard. Her plan was to have the authorities shut down the water supply entirely, further crippling Ethan's operations and discrediting his claims. When the police arrived on the scene, they found Ethan calmly overseeing the restoration of his water line, his advanced metering system already in place and functioning. Ethan presented the detailed data, showing a clear record of water usage and loss, which directly contradicted Karen's allegations. The officers, initially swayed by Karen's urgent call, were forced to acknowledge the undeniable evidence Ethan provided. In a rare moment of public embarrassment, the police documented their findings and left without taking any further action against him. But Karen wasn't finished. Determined to salvage her position, she hired a private investigator to dig up incriminating information on Ethan, hoping to expose supposed irregularities in his ranch management that could discredit his lawsuit. The investigator was tasked with covertly gathering dirt on Ethan's practices, but fate had other plans. Ethan's Vigilant Security System, which had been upgraded in anticipation of further HOA interference, captured footage of investigators sneaking around his garage at night. The video clearly showed the intruder tampering with Ethan's equipment, all while whispering instructions into a hidden microphone. At the next HOA meeting, a critical showdown where the community was eager for answers, Ethan presented this latest evidence. He played the footage for the assembled homeowners and board members, his voice calm and unwavering as he explained the full extent of Karen's desperate measures. "This," he stated, gesturing to the screen, "is proof that Karen is willing to go to any lengths, including hiring private investigators to spy on me, in order to maintain her grip on power. Her tactics are not only unethical, they're illegal." The reaction in the room was instantaneous. Gasps and murmurs filled the air as the evidence laid bare Karen's last, futile attempt to undermine Ethan's credibility. Even those who had once supported her began to question her every word. Desperation and anger etched across her face. Karen tried to interject, insisting that the footage was taken out of context and that Ethan was exaggerating the situation. But the overwhelming evidence left little room for rebuttal. Realizing that her final gambit had failed, Karen attempted one last twist. She threatened to sue Ethan for damaging the community's infrastructure if he continued with his lawsuit for the water loss, insisting that her actions were justified under HOA rules. But Ethan, with a quiet confidence born of righteous indignation, calmly countered that he was well within his rights to seek compensation for every drop of water lost, a claim backed up by irrefutable data. By the close of the meeting, it was clear that Karen's days of unchecked power were numbered. Her desperate moves, meant to salvage her authority, had only accelerated her downfall. The community's support for Ethan had reached a fever pitch, and every piece of evidence he presented was a nail in the coffin of her tyrannical rule. In the wake of the damning evidence and the community's growing outcry, the tide turned decisively against Karen and the corrupt HOA. What had begun as an isolated incident, a cut-water line, had evolved into a full-scale rebellion against bureaucratic tyranny. Homeowners, emboldened by Ethan's fearless stand and the undeniable proof of Karen's extreme tactics, began organizing protests and town hall meetings to demand accountability. At a specially convened community meeting held in the local civic center, residents recounted years of arbitrary fines, invasive inspections, and the personal hardships inflicted by Karen's overreach. Stories of water shortages, exorbitant bills, and ruined livelihoods painted a vivid picture of a regime built on intimidation. As the testimonies grew louder, even some of the previously silent members of the HOA board began to question Karen's leadership. In a dramatic, historic vote broadcast live at the meeting, the board members, under immense public pressure, unanimously voted to remove Karen from her position as HOA president. The decision was met with cheers, applause, and tears of relief from the gathered community. For the first time in years, the people had reclaimed their power and their rights. Simultaneously, local authorities announced an investigation into the HOA's financial practices, uncovering a tangled web of misappropriated funds and forged documents that further discredited Karen's administration. For Ethan, the victory was both personal and profound. His lawsuit for $100,000 and the claim for every drop of water lost had become a symbol of resistance, a tangible measure of accountability against an oppressive regime. As news of the board's decision spread, headlines across the region celebrated the end of an era of arbitrary rule. HOA tyranny toppled, and community rises against corruption read the bold titles, each one a testament to the power of collective action. In the days that followed, the new community council was formed with a promise of transparency, fairness, and respect for individual property rights. Neighbors who had long lived in fear now spoke openly about their aspirations for a future free of bureaucratic oppression. Ethan's ranch, once the target of relentless intrusion, now stood as a beacon of resilience and self-determination. Every evening, as the sun dipped low over the rejuvenated landscape, Ethan would sit on his porch with a cup of strong coffee, watching the fields and feeling a sense of hard-won peace. The electrified fence, the water metering system, and every piece of evidence he had collected were now symbols of a battle fought and won, a reminder that justice can prevail when people unite against injustice. Karen's fall was swift and unrelenting. Her once unassailable authority had crumbled under the weight of incontrovertible evidence and public outcry. Within weeks, her personal assets were frozen. Her home was put up for sale amid scandal, and the community began to celebrate the end of her reign. As the community celebrated its newfound freedom, legal authorities moved decisively against the remnants of the corrupt HOA. Bolstered by Ethan's comprehensive dossier, complete with photographs, video footage, and detailed records, the county launched a full-scale investigation into the organization's practices. The inquiry uncovered a labyrinth of misappropriated funds, forged documents, and systematic abuses that had exploited homeowners for years. A series of class action lawsuits was filed on behalf of the affected residents, and in a landmark courtroom session, the judge reviewed pages of indisputable evidence. The ruling was swift and uncompromising. The HOA was to be dissolved immediately, its assets frozen pending further legal action, and its leadership held accountable for their abuses. The state attorney general even established an independent task force to oversee the restructuring of neighborhood associations, ensuring that such tyranny would never again take root. Local newspapers and television stations picked up the story, and headlines blared of HOA tyranny dismantled and community triumph over corruption. Ethan's role in the legal proceedings was celebrated as a turning point, a testament to the power of individual courage and the collective will of a community united in the face of injustice. His groundbreaking lawsuit, demanding $100,000 in compensation for every drop of water lost, became a rallying cry for homeowners everywhere. The legal verdict sent shockwaves through the region. Former board members found themselves under intense scrutiny, and many faced criminal charges for their involvement in the corrupt practices. The dissolution of the old HOA marked the end of an era, a period defined by arbitrary fines, invasive inspections, and the abuse of power. The legal consequences were a resounding affirmation that no one was above the law, and that collective action could indeed dismantle even the most entrenched systems of oppression. With the legal hammer swinging down on the old HOA, Karen's personal world began to collapse in a series of humiliating reversals. Once the indomitable enforcer of arbitrary rules, she now found herself exposed as a tyrant whose authority was built on intimidation and greed. Public scrutiny intensified as the evidence of her corrupt practices was paraded in courtrooms and splashed across local media. Her bank accounts were frozen, and assets once flaunted with pride were seized to cover the fines levied against the HOA. In a final twist of irony, Karen was forced to resign amid a storm of public outrage. Gossip and scandal quickly followed. Neighbors whispered about her ruined reputation, and headlines chronicled her fall from grace. The once feared Karen Miller had become a byword for tyranny and abuse. The ultimate blow came when Karen, desperate to salvage some semblance of a career, accepted a position as an assistant property manager for another HOA, a role that subjected her to the very rules she had once imposed with reckless abandon. One brisk morning, as Ethan drove past a modest office building where Karen now worked in plain, unassuming attire, he couldn't help but smirk and murmur under his breath, "I hope you like following the rules." That remark, simple yet laden with irony, spread quickly among the community. Former board members and disgruntled residents recounted tales of her reign of terror, now viewed as a cautionary tale of unchecked power. Karen's personal collapse had become not only a legal verdict, but a public spectacle, a stark reminder that no one is immune from accountability. For Ethan, witnessing Karen's downfall was both a personal triumph and a vindication of his steadfast defense of his property. His ranch, scarred but unbowed by the conflict, stood as a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of individual courage and collective action. Every drop of water lost to her malice had been accounted for, every dollar of her ill-gotten gains reclaimed by justice. In the months following the dismantling of the corrupt HOA and the dramatic fall of Karen Miller, the community of Maple Hollow began to heal. The oppressive regime that had once threatened every ranch and home was now a relic of the past, replaced by a renewed sense of freedom and unity. Ethan's ranch, with its restored water line and state-of-the-art metering system, stood proudly as a beacon of resilience and independent spirit. At a celebratory community picnic held on a bright autumn afternoon, neighbors gathered to commemorate the victory over tyranny. Laughter filled the air as families shared meals, and children ran freely across the open fields. A local artist unveiled a humorous mural depicting a red-faced Karen tangled in a network of water pipes and billboards reading, "100K and every drop billed." A final, irreverent mic drop on her reign of terror. Seated on his porch with a steaming cup of coffee in hand, Ethan watched the festivities with quiet satisfaction. The painful memories of lost water and constant harassment had given way to a newfound sense of empowerment and unity. When a longtime friend approached him with a mock HOA violation notice for excessive water wastage by tyrants, Ethan simply grinned and replied, "They really tried." In that peaceful moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast the valley in hues of gold and pink, the legacy of arbitrary fines and invasive control faded into memory. The community had reclaimed its rights and restored the integrity of its cherished properties. Ethan's triumphant lawsuit and the meticulous billing for every drop of water lost had not only set a precedent, it had also proven that when individuals stand together, even the most overreaching authority can be held accountable. Fade to black.